There are moments in history that refuse to fade, events so saturated with blood and betrayal that they seep into the soil itself, staining the ground where they occur with a darkness that never quite washes away. The Iron Pit Bloodbath of 1964 is one such moment. A night when the machinery of industry ground to a halt and the machinery of vengeance roared to life, when two brothers cross a line so absolute that the echo of their actions still reverberates through the hollows and valleys of western Pennsylvania. This is not a story about heroes. There are no heroes here. This is a story about what happens when loyalty becomes poison, when brotherhood becomes a weapon, and when the promise of justice curdles into something far more terrible. This is a story about Karl and Henrik Sorenson, two men who believed they had been wronged, and who decided that the only appropriate response to betrayal was annihilation. The year 1964 sits in the American consciousness like a bruise that never quite healed. It was a year of change, of upheaval, of the slow death of one world and the painful birth of another. The Civil Rights Act was signed into law. The Beatles arrived on American shores. Young men were being shipped to a place called Vietnam, a name that would soon become synonymous with loss. But in the small mining town of Black Ridge, Pennsylvania, tucked into the Appalachian foothills where the coal seams ran deep and the winters ran long, 1964 meant something else entirely. It meant the end of an era. The iron pit mine, the town's lifeblood for 3 generations, was dying. Production had slowed to a crawl. The company, Consolidated Mining Corporation, a faceless entity headquartered somewhere in Pittsburgh, had begun the slow process of bleeding the operation dry, extracting what value remained before abandoning the site entirely. The miners knew it. They felt it in their bones in the shortened shifts and delayed paychecks, in the way management stopped making eye contact when they walked to the yard. And so the union Local 447 of the United Mine Workers became more than just an organization. It became a lifeline, a last desperate hope that collective action might save what individual effort could not. Karl Sorenson was 36 years old in the spring of 1964, a thick-shouldered man with hands like slabs of granite and a face that rarely showed emotion. He had worked the iron pit since he was 17, following his father into the earth the way his father had followed his own, a generational chain that stretched back to the mine's opening in 1903. Karl was a shift foreman, respected by the men who worked under him for his fairness, and feared by those who crossed him for his temper. He had a wife, Magda, and 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, living in a narrow company house on the eastern edge of town, a structure identical to 40 others on the same street, painted the same dull gray, heated by the same coal stoves. Henrik, younger by 4 years, was different. Where Karl was solid and predictable, Henrik was volatile, unpredictable, a man whose mood shifted like smoke. He worked the deepest shafts, the places where the air was thin and the darkness absolute, and he seemed to prefer it that way, as if the isolation suited him. Henrik had never married. He lived alone in a converted rail car on the outskirts of Black Ridge, a rusted cylinder that rattled in the wind, and he drank too much and spoke too little. But when the union called for volunteers to serve on a negotiating committee, both brothers stepped forward. They believed in the union. They believed in solidarity. They believed that if they stood together, they might have a chance. The negotiations began in March, held in a rented room above Kostof's Hardware on Main Street, a cramped space that smelled of sawdust and turpentine. 14 men sat on the union side, Karl and Henrik among them, facing 3 representatives from Consolidated Mining. The company men wore suits. The miners wore work clothes, their hands still stained with coal dust no matter how hard they scrubbed. The meetings dragged on for weeks. The union demanded wage protections, pension guarantees, a commitment that the mine would remain operational for at least 5 more years. The company countered with cuts, reductions, the cold arithmetic of quarterly earnings. It was a dance both sides had performed before, a ritual of posturing and compromise. But something was different this time. There was a desperation in the air, a sense that this was a last negotiation, the final chance. And then, in late April, the union committee voted. 13 men voted to accept the company's offer, a package that included modest wage increases, but gutted the pension fund and offered no guarantee of continued employment. Karl voted no. Henrik voted no. They were outvoted. The deal was accepted. The strike was called off. And the Sorenson brothers walked out of that meeting believing they had been betrayed. Betrayal is a word that carries weight, a word that can mean many things depending on who speaks it. To the 13 men who voted yes, the decision was pragmatic, a recognition of reality, an attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. To Karl and Henrik Sorenson, it was treason. They believed, perhaps rightly, perhaps not, that the other committee members had been bought, that Consolidated Mining had paid them off, slipped them envelopes of cash, or promised them positions in other operations. Anything to secure their compliance. There was no proof. There was only suspicion, the corrosive kind that eats away at trust and leaves nothing but rage. In the weeks that followed, the brothers became pariahs. They spoke openly about the betrayal, confronting men in the mine yard, in the bars, in the streets. They demanded answers. They received silence. The union leadership told them to let it go, to move on, to accept that they had lost. But Karl and Henrik Sorenson were not men who moved on. They were men who remembered. They were men who planned. And in the summer of 1964, as the days grew long and the heat pressed down on Blackridge like a weight, they began to compile a list. The list was written on a sheet of lined paper torn from a school notebook, folded and refolded until the creases threatened to tear through. It contained 14 names, the 13 men who had voted yes, and Walter Kessler, the union representative who had facilitated the negotiations. Each name was written in Karl's careful block letters, each one underlined twice. The brothers kept a list in a tin box hidden beneath the floorboards of Henrik's rail car, alongside a collection of items that would later be cataloged by investigators. 3 hunting rifles, 2 shotguns, a .38 revolver, boxes of ammunition, a hand-drawn map of Blackridge with addresses marked in red, and a single photograph of the negotiating committee taken outside Kostov's hardware on the first day of talks. The photograph showed 14 men standing in 2 rows, some smiling, some serious, all of them unaware that they were posing for what would later be described as a death roster. The brothers studied that photograph. They memorized faces, routines, schedules. They watched, they waited, and they began to believe that what they were planning was not murder, but justice. Justice and vengeance are separated by the thinnest of lines, a boundary so fragile that it shatters under the weight of anger. The Sorenson brothers convinced themselves they were on the right side of that line. They told themselves they were acting in defense of principle, of honor, of a union itself. They spoke in the language of soldiers, of men at war, as if the committee members were not their neighbors and co-workers, but enemy combatants. Henrik, always the more volatile of the two, talked about cleansing the union, about purging the corruption, about sending a message that betrayal would not be tolerated. Karl, quieter but no less committed, framed it as a necessary sacrifice, a way to restore integrity to an institution that had been compromised. They were wrong, of course. What they were planning was not justice. It was annihilation. But by the time summer turned to fall, by the time the leaves began to drop from the maples and oaks that lined Blackridge's narrow streets, the brothers had moved beyond reason. They had entered a space where logic no longer applied, where the only truth that mattered was the one they had constructed in their own minds. The plan was simple in its brutality. They would strike on a single night, moving through Blackridge in a calculated sequence, hitting each target in turn. They would not give warnings. They would not demand confessions. They would simply execute the list, one name at a time, until all 14 were crossed off. The date was chosen with care. October 12, 1964, a Saturday night when most of the town would be home, when the bars would be full and the streets would be empty, when the sound of gunfire might be mistaken for fireworks or backfiring engines. The brothers spent the final weeks of September preparing. They test-fired their weapons in the woods east of town, adjusting sights and checking mechanisms. They rehearsed the route, timing each leg of the journey, identifying escape paths and fallback positions. They acquired a vehicle, a stolen 1959 Ford pickup with the license plates removed, and stashed it in an abandoned barn on the outskirts of Blackridge. And they waited for the night to arrive, for the moment when words would give way to action, when planning would become reality. October 12th, 1964, dawned cold and clear, the kind of autumn day that carries a promise of winter in the bite of the wind. The town of Blackridge went about its business. Men, worked the morning shift at the Iron Pit. Women shopped at Kostoff's Hardware and Miller's Grocery. Children played in the streets, kicking cans and throwing footballs, unaware that their world was about to fracture. By evening, the temperature had dropped into the 40s. A thin layer of frost began to form on windshields and porch railings. The bars filled with their usual Saturday night crowds, miners drinking away the week's exhaustion, families gathering for meals, the ordinary rhythms of small-town life. At 9:47 p.m., those rhythms stopped. The first shots were fired at the home of Walter Kessler, the union representative who had led the negotiations. Kessler lived on Birch Street, a quiet residential block 3 streets over from the main drag. He was sitting in his living room, watching television with his wife and 2 teenage sons, when the front window exploded inward. Karl Sorenson fired 6 rounds through the glass with a .30-06 hunting rifle, striking Kessler twice in the chest and once in the neck. He died before the ambulance arrived. His wife, shielded by the couch, survived. His sons, frozen in shock, watched their father bleed out on the carpet. The brothers did not linger. They were back in the truck and moving toward the next address before the screaming began. The second target was James Horak, a mechanic who had voted yes and lived in a basement apartment on the south side of town. The brothers found him walking home from O'Malley's Tavern, a paper bag containing a 6-pack of beer clutched in one hand. Henrik approached him from behind and shot him twice in the back of the head with a .38 revolver. Horak collapsed face first onto the sidewalk, the bag splitting open, bottles rolling into the gutter. A witness, a woman walking her dog, heard the shots and saw 2 men climbing into a dark-colored truck, but she could not identify them in the darkness. The truck disappeared down an alley. The witness ran to the nearest house and pounded on the door, screaming for help. By the time anyone reached Horak, he was dead. The brothers moved quickly now, racing against time and inevitable response. The third target was Leon Dempsey, a loader-operator who lived in one of the company houses near the mine entrance. They found him in his backyard, smoking a cigarette and staring up at the stars, a ritual he performed every night before bed. Karl shot him from 20 feet away, a single round that entered through his left temple and exited through the right. Dempsey dropped without a sound. His wife, hearing the shot, came to the back door and saw her husband's body sprawled on the grass. She started screaming. The brothers were already gone. The 4th, 5th, and 6th targets came in rapid succession, a cascade of violence that unfolded across Black Ridge like a wildfire. Michael Tarnowski shot through the kitchen window of his home while washing dishes. Anton Resnick ambushed in his driveway as he unloaded groceries from his car. Victor Kaminsky killed in his garage while working on a motorcycle engine, the sound of the shot masked by the noise of his radio. Each murder followed the same pattern. Quick, efficient, brutal. The brothers worked with a cold precision, ticking names off the list, moving from address to address with the mechanical determination of men who had convinced themselves they were performing a duty. By 11:15 p.m., 6 men were dead. The town was in chaos. Police Chief Edward Novak, a 53-year-old career lawman who had never dealt with anything more serious than bar fights and petty theft, found himself trying to coordinate a response to what he could not yet comprehend was a coordinated massacre. Reports were flooding in from every corner of Black Ridge. Shots fired on Birch Street, a body on the south side, screams coming from the company houses. Novak called for backup from the state police, but the nearest barracks was 40 miles away. He was on his own. The 7th victim was Robert Dunn, a blaster who had served on the negotiating committee and who lived alone in a small cabin on the eastern edge of town, near the tree line where the forest began. Dunn had been drinking heavily that night, drowning his guilt, because he did feel guilt about the vote, about the way Karl and Henrik had looked at him in the weeks since. And when the brothers arrived, he was passed out on his couch, the television flickering in the darkness. Henrik kicked in the front door. Dunn woke with a start, confused and disoriented, and saw 2 figures silhouetted against the doorway. He tried to stand. He tried to speak. Henrik shot him 4 times in the chest. Dunn collapsed back onto the couch, blood spreading across the upholstery in dark, widening pools. The brothers left him there, the television still playing, casting blue light across his lifeless face. They drove north, toward the industrial district, where several of the committee members lived in apartments above the old feed mill. The eighth victim was Gregory Petrov, a young miner who had voted yes out of fear, terrified that he would lose his job and his ability to support his pregnant wife. Petrov heard the commotion in the street below, sirens shouting, the sound of engines, and looked out his window just as the brothers pulled up. He recognized Karl's face in the glow of the streetlight. He tried to run. Henrik shot him through the door as he fled toward the back of the apartment. The bullet struck him in the spine. He fell paralyzed, screaming for help. The brothers left him there. He would bleed to death before anyone found him. By midnight, the state police had arrived, 3 cruisers and 8 troopers, but they were hours behind the violence, trying to piece together what was happening from scattered reports and panicked witnesses. Chief Novak, coordinating from the small police station on Main Street, finally began to see the pattern. The victims were all members of the negotiating committee. This was not random. This was targeted. This was execution. He sent officers to warn the remaining committee members, but it was too late for most of them. The 9th victim was Thomas Kowalski, a loader who lived in a trailer park on the western outskirts of town. Kowalski had barricaded himself inside his trailer after hearing about the killings, pushing furniture against the door, loading his own shotgun, determined to fight back. But when the brothers arrived, they did not try to enter. Instead, they fired through the walls, dozens of rounds from rifles and shotguns, turning the thin metal shell of the trailer into a sieve. Kowalski was hit 11 times. He died clutching his weapon, never firing a shot. The 10th and 11th victims were brothers themselves. Frank and Joseph Marino, inseparable twins who had worked the iron pit together for 20 years and who had voted yes together, believing it was the only way to protect their families. They were at Frank's house, sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of the reports coming over the radio, when Karl and Henrik crashed through the back door. The Sorenson brothers shot them both at point-blank range, emptying their weapons into Marinos until there was nothing left to shoot. The kitchen was painted red. The radio continued to play, a news bulletin about the escalating violence in Blackridge, the announcer's voice calm and detached, describing a nightmare as if it were a weather report. The 12th victim was Stanley Novotny, a quiet man who had never wanted to be on the negotiating committee, but had been elected by his shift and felt obligated to serve. Novotny lived in a small house on the northern edge of town, near the cemetery, and when he heard the sirens and the gunfire, he took his wife and 2 young daughters and hid in the basement, praying that the violence would pass them by. It did not. The brothers found the house dark and silent. They broke in through the cellar window. Novotny, armed only with a tire iron, tried to defend his family. He managed to strike Henrik across the shoulder, a glancing blow that did no real damage but enraged the younger Sorenson. Henrik shot Novotny in the stomach, then in the chest, then in the face. The wife and daughters, cowering in the corner, were screaming. Karl hesitated. For the first time that night, something broke through the fog of rage. He looked at the children, at their terrified faces, and he realized what they had become. He grabbed Henrik by the arm and pulled him toward the stairs. They fled, leaving Novotny dying on the basement floor, leaving his family traumatized but alive. The 13th victim was the one that would haunt the brothers for the rest of their brief, violent lives. His name was Peter Schultz, and he was not on the list. Schultz was a mechanic who had never served on the negotiating committee, who had no connection to the union vote, who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was driving home from a late shift at the mine, his headlights cutting through the darkness, when he came upon the Sorenson brothers standing beside their stolen truck on a deserted stretch of road east of town. They were reloading their weapons, planning their final strike. Schultz slowed down, rolled down his window, asked if they needed help. He recognized Karl. They had worked together years before. He smiled. He offered them a ride. Henrik, paranoid and wired on adrenaline, believed Schultz had seen too much, that he would identify them, that he was a threat. Before Karl could stop him, Henrik raised his revolver and shot Schultz through the open window. The bullet entered below his left eye and exited through the back of his skull. Schultz's car veered off the road and crashed into a ditch. The engine continued to run, headlights pointed at the sky. Karl stood frozen, staring at the wreckage, at the body slumped over the steering wheel. This was different. This was not justice. This was murder. He turned to Henrik, and for the first time, he questioned what they had done. But Henrik was already moving, climbing back into the truck, urging Karl to hurry. There was one name left on the list. The 14th and final target was supposed to be Martin Kovar, a shift supervisor who had not only voted yes, but had argued loudly in favor of accepting the company's offer, claiming that resistance was futile and that the union was fighting a losing battle. Kovar lived in a well-maintained house on the northern side of Blackridge, a 2-story structure with a white picket fence and a garden that he tended with obsessive care. He was a fastidious man, a rule follower, someone who believed in order and procedure. When he heard the reports of the killings, he called the police station and demanded protection. Chief Novak, stretched impossibly thin, promised to send an officer but admitted it might take time. Kovar locked every door and window. He turned off the lights. He sat in his living room with a loaded hunting rifle across his lap, waiting in the darkness, listening to the distant wail of sirens. The Sorenson brothers arrived at 1:23 a.m. They parked the truck a block away and approached on foot, moving through the shadows, rifles ready. But the state police had finally pieced together the pattern. 2 troopers, dispatched by Novak, were waiting in a patrol car parked across the street from Kovar's house. When Karl and Henrik stepped into the glow of a streetlight, the troopers saw them. They saw the weapons. They shouted a command to drop the guns. The brothers opened fire. The gunfight lasted less than 2 minutes, but felt like an eternity. The troopers returned fire from behind their cruiser, bullets sparking off metal, shattering glass, tearing through the night. Henrik was hit first. A round that struck him in the thigh, shattering his femur. He fell, screaming, still firing wildly. Karl dragged him behind a parked car, trying to shield him, trying to cover their retreat. But there was nowhere to go. More police were arriving, sirens converging from every direction, the net closing. Karl made a decision. He stood, hands raised, rifle dropped to the ground. He surrendered. Henrik, bleeding and delirious, tried to keep fighting. A trooper shot him in the chest. He collapsed, gasping, drowning in his own blood. Karl knelt beside him, cradling his brother's head, whispering something the troopers could not hear. Henrik Sorenson died at 1:34 a.m. on October 13th, 1964, on the street in front of Martin Kovar's house, the 14th and final victim of the Iron Pit bloodbath. Karl Sorenson was arrested and charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of voluntary manslaughter. The manslaughter charge related to Peter Schultz, the mechanic who had not been on the list. The trial, held in the spring of 1965, was a media sensation. Reporters from Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and New York descended on Blackridge, transforming the small town into a spectacle. The prosecution argued that the killings were premeditated, methodical, and motivated by irrational rage. The defense, led by a court-appointed attorney who was clearly out of his depth, attempted to argue temporary insanity, claiming that Karl and Henrik had been driven mad by the stress of the union negotiations and the perceived betrayal. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Karl Sorenson was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, after Pennsylvania suspended its death penalty in 1972. Karl served 41 years in the State Correctional Institution at Graterford, a maximum security prison west of Philadelphia. He died in 2006 at the age of 78, never expressing remorse, never admitting guilt, maintaining until the end that he and Henrik had been justified in their actions. The town of Blackridge never recovered. The Iron Pit mine closed permanently in 1967, the company citing declining production and labor unrest. Though everyone knew the real reason was a massacre, the stain it had left on the community, the way investors and customers had fled from anything associated with the name. The population, which had peaked at just over 3,000 in the early 1960s, dwindled to fewer than 500 by 1980. The company houses were abandoned, left to rot, their windows broken and their roofs caving in. The bars closed. The grocery store closed. Blackridge became a ghost town, a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else, a name synonymous with violence and tragedy. The families of the victims scattered, unable to bear the memories, unable to live in a place where every street corner held the echo of gunfire. Memorials were erected, simple plaques bearing the names of the 13 committee members who died that night, Peter Schultz included as an addendum. But they were vandalized repeatedly, defaced by those who still believed, irrationally, that the Sorensons had been right, that Betrayal deserved death. There are those who argue, even now, that the Iron Pit bloodbath was not simply the act of two madmen, but a symptom of something larger, a manifestation of the rage and desperation that gripped America's working class in the 1960s as industries collapsed and unions crumbled. They point to the economic pressures, the corporate greed, the sense of abandonment felt by men like Karl and Henrik Sorenson, men who had given their lives to the mine and received nothing in return. They argue that the real villains were not the brothers, but the system that created them, the consolidated mining corporation that bled Blackridge dry, the union leadership that failed to protect its members. There is truth in this argument. There is also danger, because no matter how justified the grievances, no matter how real the betrayal, nothing can justify what happened on October 12, 1964. 13 men died. 13 families were shattered. A town was destroyed. And for what? For a vote? For a decision made in a cramped room above a hardware store? For a piece of paper folded and refolded until it became a death warrant? The psychology of the Sorenson brothers has been analyzed endlessly by criminologists, historians, and psychologists seeking to understand how ordinary men become killers. Karl, by all accounts, was a stable, respected member of the community before the massacre, a man who paid his bills on time, attended church on Sundays, coached his son's little league team. Henrik was more volatile, more prone to anger and isolation, but even he had never shown signs of the kind of extreme violence he would later commit. What transformed them? Was it the betrayal, real or perceived, by men they considered brothers? Was it the economic desperation? The fear of losing everything they had worked for? Was it simply the toxic combination of rage and opportunity? Two men feeding off each other's anger until it became something monstrous? The answer, unsatisfying as it may be, is likely all the above. Human beings are not simple machines with single points of failure. We are complex, contradictory, capable of great compassion and great cruelty, often in rapid succession. The Sorenson brothers were not born monsters. They were made by circumstance, by choice, by a series of small decisions that accumulated until there was no turning back. The list, that folded piece of paper with 14 names written in block letters, was recovered from Henrik's rail car after the massacre. It is now stored in the Pennsylvania State Archives, cataloged alongside other artifacts of the case. Photographs, witness statements, ballistics reports, the weapons used in the killings. Researchers who have examined the list note the care with which it was compiled, the precision of the handwriting, the double underlines beneath each name. It is a chilling document, not because of what it says, but because of what it represents. The moment when anger became action, when grievance became murder, when two men decided that their sense of justice was more important than the lives of their neighbors. The list is a reminder that the line between civilization and savagery is not a wall, but a thread, easily broken, difficult to repair. And once that thread is severed, there is no going back. There is only the aftermath, the wreckage, the long shadow of violence that stretches across generations. In the years since the massacre, Blackridge has become a curiosity, a dark tourism destination for those fascinated by true crime and American tragedy. Visitors wander the empty streets, photographing the abandoned houses and the rustic gate of the Iron Pit mine. They search for the sites of the killings, guided by maps drawn from trial testimony and newspaper accounts. Some come out of genuine interest in history. Others come seeking thrills, drawn to macabre, treating the deaths of real people as entertainment. The few remaining residents of Blackridge, mostly elderly, too stubborn or too poor to leave, watch these visitors with a mixture of resignation and resentment. They do not want to be defined by the massacre. They do not want their town to be remembered only for the night it bled. But memory is not something we control. Memory is something that controls us, shaping the stories we tell and the way we understand ourselves. And in Blackridge, the memory of October 12, 1964 is inescapable. The union, Local 447, was dissolved in 1968, its membership scattered, its reputation destroyed by the association with the massacre. The United Mine Workers distanced themselves from the events, issuing statements condemning the violence and reaffirming their commitment to peaceful negotiation. But the damage was done. The Iron Pit bloodbath became a cautionary tale, invoked by union opponents as evidence of the dangers of radicalism, of what happens when workers believe they have been wronged. It was a distortion, of course, a willful misreading of what had occurred. The massacre was not the product of union activism, but of its failure, of the breakdown of collective action, of two men who chose violence because they had lost faith in every other option. But distortions are powerful. They shape public perception. They influence policy. And in the years following the massacre, unions across America found themselves under increased scrutiny, their legitimacy questioned, their membership declining. The Iron Pit bloodbath became a weapon wielded against working people by those who had always sought to undermine their power. There is a photograph, taken the morning after the massacre, that captures the mood of Blackridge in the aftermath. It shows a group of miners standing outside the entrance to the iron pit, their faces drawn and hollow, their eyes staring at something beyond the camera's frame. They are not working. The mine is silent. The machinery is still. They are simply standing, bearing witness, try to comprehend the incomprehensible. One man has his hand over his mouth. Another has his arms crossed, his head bowed. A third is staring directly at the camera, his expression one of exhausted disbelief. The photograph was published in newspapers across the country, often accompanied by headlines that reduce the complexity of the event to a single phrase. Union violence claims 14 lives. But the miners in that photograph were not celebrating violence. They were mourning it. They were mourning their friends, their neighbors, their community. They were mourning the death of something larger than individuals, the death of solidarity, of trust, of the belief that collective action could make a difference. Karl Sorenson's final interview, conducted by a journalist from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette in 2003, offers a glimpse into the mind of a man who has spent nearly 4 decades in prison for his crimes. The journalist asked him if he had any regrets. Karl, by then 75 years old, his hair white and his body frail, paused for a long time before answering. He said that he regretted Peter Schultz, the mechanic who had not been on the list, the man who had offered them help. He said that killing Schultz had been a mistake, an accident, something Henrik had done in a moment of panic. But when asked about the others, about the 13 men who had voted yes, Karl's expression hardened. He said they had betrayed the Union. He said they had sold out their brothers. He said they had deserved what they got. The journalist pressed him, pointing out that many of the victims had families, children, lives beyond that single vote. Karl shrugged. He said that every action has consequences. He said that betrayal demanded a response. He said that he and Henrik had done what they believed was necessary. The interview ended shortly after. The journalist left the prison shaken, unable to reconcile the frail old man in front of him with the monster who had orchestrated the Iron Pit bloodbath. But that is the nature of evil. It does not always announce itself with fangs and claws. Sometimes it wears the face of an ordinary man, convinced that his rage is righteous, that his violence is justice. The question that haunts the Iron Pit bloodbath is not what happened. The facts are clear, documented in trial transcripts and police reports. But why it happened? Why did 2 men, both of whom had lived unremarkable lives, both of whom had families and friends and futures, decide that murder was the only answer? Why did they believe that killing 13 men they had worked beside, men they had shared meals with, men who were not enemies but neighbors, was justified? The answer lies in the human capacity for self-deception, for constructing narratives that absolve us of guilt and frame our actions as noble. Karl and Henrik Sorenson told themselves a story. They told themselves they were warriors defending a sacred cause. They told themselves they were acting on behalf of the Union, on behalf of justice, on behalf of something larger than themselves. They were wrong. But the story was powerful enough to override their humanity, to transform them from men into monsters. And that is the true horror of the Iron Pit bloodbath. Not that it happened, but that it could happen, that any of us, given the right combination of anger and opportunity and self-justification, might be capable of the same. The families of the victims have never forgiven. They cannot forgive. How do you forgive the murder of a father, a husband, a brother? How do you forgive the destruction of a life, the theft of a future? Some of the families left Blackridge immediately after the massacre, fleeing the town and everything it represented. Others stayed, bound by inertia or obligation, living in the shadow of the violence, raising children in a place that had become synonymous with death. The children of the victims grew up haunted by the stories, by the photographs, by the empty chairs at holiday dinners. Some became activists, channeling their grief into causes: gun control, prison reform, union advocacy. Others retreated into silence, unable to speak about what had happened, unable to process the enormity of the loss. A few, tragically, followed their fathers into the darkness, succumbing to addiction or suicide, unable to escape the gravity of the massacre. The ripples of that single night spread outward, touching lives of generations, proving that violence is never contained, never finished, never over. There's a marker now, at the edge of Blackridge, a simple stone monument erected by the State Historical Society in 1989. It reads, "In memory of the 14 victims of the Iron Pit Bloodbath, October 12, 1964. May we remember the past so that we may never repeat it." The sentiment is noble, necessary even, but hollow in the face of what occurred. Because the past is not something we remember once and put away. The past is alive. It breathes in the empty houses of Blackridge, in the rusted equipment at the iron pit, in the silence that settles over the town when the wind stops blowing. The past refuses to stay buried, and perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps we need to be reminded, again and again, of what we are capable of the distance between civilization and chaos, of how easily one becomes the other. The weapons used in the massacre were destroyed after Karl Sorenson's conviction, melted down in accordance with state law, transformed from instruments of death into shapeless lumps of metal. But the photograph of the negotiating committee, the one that had hung in Henrik's rail car, that had been studied and memorized by the brothers as they planned their attack, that photograph survived. It was entered into evidence at trial, marked as Exhibit 17, and it remains in the case file to this day. Looking at that photograph now, knowing what happened to nearly every person in it, is an exercise in profound sadness. These were ordinary men. They had no idea they were posing for posterity, no sense that this image would outlive them, that it would become a record of the dead. They look relaxed, some of them smiling, caught in a moment of normalcy that would never return. The photograph is a ghost, a frozen instant before the fall, a reminder that we never know when we are standing at the edge of disaster. The town's children, those who were young in 1964, carry the weight of the massacre differently than their parents. They did not lose fathers or brothers in violence, but they lost their innocence, their sense of safety, their belief in the fundamental goodness of their community. They remember the sirens, the confusion, the hushed conversations among adults, the funerals that stretched on for weeks. They remember being afraid, not understanding why men they knew, men who had waved them from passing cars, men who had coached their baseball teams, were suddenly gone. Some of these children, now in their 60s and 70s, still live in or near Blackridge. They speak about the massacre in quiet tones, with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. They say it changed everything. They say the town died that night, even though some of its residents survived. They say that Blackridge was never about coal or mining or industry. It was about people, about community, about the belief that neighbors looked out for one another. And when that belief shattered, when neighbors became killers, when trust evaporated, there was nothing left to hold the town together. The broader implications of the Iron Pit Bloodbath extend far beyond Blackridge. In the decades since, criminologists and sociologists have studied a massacre as a case study in collective violence, in the breakdown of social bonds, in the ways that economic stress and perceived injustice can radicalize individuals. The Sorenson brothers are often compared to other perpetrators of mass violence, not because their motivations were identical, but because they followed a similar psychological trajectory. They isolated themselves both physically and emotionally. They developed an us versus them mentality, viewing the committee members not as complex individuals but as symbols of betrayal. They created a justification narrative, a story that framed their violence as necessary and righteous. and they acted with cold determination, executing their plan with precision that spoke to premeditation and intent. Understanding this trajectory does not excuse the violence. Nothing can excuse it. But understanding is the first step toward prevention, toward recognizing the warning signs before the next tragedy unfolds. The role of the Consolidated Mining Corporation in the events leading to the massacre cannot be ignored. The company's decision to gut the pension fund, to offer no guarantees of continued employment, to squeeze every last ounce of profit from the iron pit before abandoning it, these decisions created the conditions for desperation. They did not pull the trigger. They did not write the list. But they created the environment in which men like Karl and Henrik Sorenson felt they had no options, no recourse, no future. Corporate greed is not usually counted among the causes of violence, but it should be. When companies treat workers as disposable, when they prioritize shareholders over people who generate the wealth, when they extract and abandon, they plant the seeds of rage. That rage does not always manifest as violence. Most often, it manifests as quiet suffering, as broken bodies and broken families, as towns that wither and die. But sometimes, rarely, it explodes. And when it does, the consequences are catastrophic. The union movement in America never fully recovered from the damage inflicted by events like the Iron Pit Bloodbath. The narrative shifted. Unions, once seen as champions of the working class, were increasingly portrayed as corrupt, violent, out of touch. The Sorenson brothers became a symbol, weaponized by those who opposed organized labor, used to argue that unions bred extremism, that collective action led to chaos. It was a lie, of course, a calculated distortion of a single event, stripped of context, used to justify the dismantling of worker protections. But lies are powerful when they are repeated often enough. By the 1980s, union membership was in freefall. Factories closed. Jobs moved overseas. The American working class, once the backbone of the economy, was left to fend for itself, told that the market would provide, that competition would create opportunity, that solidarity was weakness. The Iron Pit Bloodbath became a footnote, a cautionary tale invoked to justify the gutting of labor power. And the real lesson, that desperation breeds violence, that abandonment breeds rage, that people will fight back when they have nothing left to lose, was ignored. Karl Sorenson's death in 2006 was barely noted outside of Pennsylvania. A brief obituary appeared in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, summarizing his crimes and his sentence, offering no commentary, no reflection, no attempt to understand the man beyond the monster. His body was cremated. His ashes were not claimed by any family member. They remain in storage at the prison, unclaimed and unwanted, a final indignity for a man who destroyed so many lives, including his own. Henrik Sorenson has no grave. His body, after being autopsied and released by the coroner, was buried in a pauper's section of the county cemetery, an unmarked plot in a field of weeds. There are no visitors. There are no flowers. There is only silence, and perhaps that is the most fitting memorial, oblivion, erasure, the absence of remembrance. The survivors of the massacre, the widows, the children, the witnesses, carry scars that never fully heal. Margaret Kessler, who watched her husband die in their living room, never remarried. She raised her 2 sons alone, working multiple jobs to keep the house, to pay for school, to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She died in 1998, having never spoken publicly about the massacre, having locked the memory away in some deep part of herself where it could not be reached. Her sons, now middle-aged men, still live in Pennsylvania, though not in Blackridge. They do not speak about their father. They do not speak about that night. When asked, they change the subject. The trauma is too deep, too raw, even after all these years. Peter Schultz's widow remarried and moved to Ohio, desperate to escape the association with the massacre, to build a new life in a place where her husband's death was not common knowledge. She took her maiden name. She never told her new husband about what had happened. The secret ate at her, a weight she carried into her death in 2015. Her children, learning the truth only after sorting through her belongings, were devastated, not by the facts themselves, but by the realization that their mother had lived in silence, had borne the burden alone, had believed that speaking about the violence would somehow taint them. The question of culpability extends beyond the Sorenson brothers. Could the massacre have been prevented? Were there warning signs that were ignored? The answer is yes. In the weeks leading up to October 12th, Karl and Henrik had become increasingly vocal about their anger, increasingly isolated from the rest of the community. They had confronted committee members publicly. They had made threats, vague but alarming. Several people, in hindsight, reported feeling uneasy around the brothers, sensing that something was wrong. But no one acted. No one reported the threats to police. No one intervened. This is not to blame the victims or the community. Intervening is difficult, dangerous, complicated by social bonds and the reluctance to escalate conflicts. But it is a reminder that violence does not appear from nowhere. It builds. It accumulates. It announces itself, often loudly, before it erupts. And we, as a society, need to be better at recognizing those signals, at taking them seriously, at acting before the unthinkable becomes reality. The Iron Pit itself, the mine that had been the center of Blackridge's economy and identity, closed permanently in 1967. The equipment was removed. The shafts were sealed. The land was left to decay. Over the decades, nature reclaimed what industry had taken. His widow later said that Martin had never truly escaped October 12, 1964. They had lived every day since in its shadow, waiting for the violence to return. The state troopers who responded to the massacre, who engaged the Sorenson brothers in the final gunfight, who saw the bodies and the blood and the devastation, carried their own scars. Several developed post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that was poorly understood and poorly treated in the 1960s. One trooper, James Callahan, left law enforcement entirely 6 months after the massacre, unable to continue. He moved to a rural property in upstate Pennsylvania and lived as a recluse for the rest of his life, speaking to almost no one, haunted by the memories of that night. Another trooper, Michael DiNardo, stayed on the force but became known for his emotional volatility, his inability to handle stress, his tendency to overreact to minor threats. He was eventually forced into early retirement. These men were not counted among the victims of the Iron Pit bloodbath, but they were victims nonetheless, their lives shaped and scarred by an event they had not chosen, by violence they had been called to stop. The question that haunts every discussion of the Iron Pit bloodbath, the question that underlies every analysis and every retelling, is the simplest and most difficult of all. Could it have been prevented? And if so, how? The answer is both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that there were warning signs, that the Sorenson brothers had made threats, that their anger was visible and escalating. If someone had taken those signs seriously, if authorities had intervened, if the community had found a way to address the brothers' grievances or at least contain their rage, perhaps the violence could have been averted. But no, in the sense that the deeper causes, the economic abandonment, the collapse of community, the sense of betrayal and powerlessness, were beyond any individual's ability to fix. The Sorenson brothers were symptoms of a larger disease, a societal failure to value human beings over profit, to protect communities over corporate interests, to ensure that people had a stake in the system they were asked to support. Fixing that would have required systemic change, political will, a commitment to economic justice. It would have required a different America than the one that existed in 1964. And it would require a different America than the one that exists today. The Iron Pit bloodbath stands as a warning, a reminder that desperation has consequences, that rage demands an outlet, that when people feel they've been abandoned and betrayed, some will strike back. Not all, not most, but some. And the violence, when it comes, is never contained. It spreads. It destroys. It leaves scars that last for generations. We tell ourselves that we have learned from the past, that we understand the lessons of history, that we will not repeat the mistakes that led to places like Blackridge. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Across America, towns are dying. Industries are collapsing. Communities are being abandoned. People are angry, desperate, looking for someone to blame. The conditions that created Karl and Henrik Sorenson still exist. They exist in the Rust Belt, in the coal fields, in the rural communities that have been gutted by globalization and automation and the relentless pursuit of profit. And so the question is not whether another Iron Pit bloodbath could happen. The question is when and where, and whether we will finally do something to prevent it. Names change. Circumstances shift, but the pattern remains. A decision made in desperation, a line crossed in anger, a moment when justice and vengeance become indistinguishable, when a human capacity for violence overwhelms the fragile structures of civilization. The Sorenson brothers are gone, but the forces that created them are not. They simmer beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark, the next betrayal, the next moment when someone decides that the only response to powerlessness is annihilation. Until we address those forces, until we build a society that values all its members, that refuses to sacrifice communities on the altar of profit, that provides pathways to dignity and security for everyone, the cycle will continue. The names will change. The locations will differ. But the violence, the rage, the blood, those will remain. And we will tell ourselves once again that we never saw it coming, that it was unpreventable, that there was nothing we could have done. We will be wrong. We are always wrong. The warning signs are always there. We simply choose not to see them, until it is too late, until the night of broken glass and echoing gunfire, until the list is complete, and the dead are counted, and the survivors are left to piece together the shattered remains of their lives. This is a legacy of the Iron Pit Bloodbath, not just the 14 lives lost on October 12, 1964, but the countless lives touched by that violence, shaped by it, broken by it. It is a legacy of grief and trauma, and the slow erosion of hope. It is a legacy that asks us to look at ourselves, at our society, at the choices we make and the systems we uphold. It asks us to recognize that we are all connected, that the suffering of one community is the suffering of all, that abandonment and betrayal and economic violence have consequences that cannot be ignored. It asks us to do better, to be better, to build a world where people like Karl and Henrik Sorenson never feel so desperate, so betrayed, so convinced that violence is the only answer. That world is possible, but it requires work. It requires empathy. It requires a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths and make difficult changes. It requires us to remember the past, not to wallow in tragedy, but to learn from it, to let it guide us toward a better future. The Iron Pit refuses to stay buried. Perhaps it should not. Perhaps we need to be reminded, again and again, of what we are capable of how easily civilization fractures, of how thin the line truly is between the world we want and the world we fear. Perhaps that is the only way we will ever change.